Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Andrew Thompson. He's a professor of parasitology at Murdoch University in Australia. He's gotten up at an ungodly hour to do this interview, so I appreciate that very much. Andrew, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Tell me about what spurred your interest in parasites, a long time ago, whenever you started working with them.
It was a long time ago. Well, basically my training initially was as a zoologist, and it came down to basically my teachers, and my teacher in invertebrate zoology came up with a list of projects that we had to do for our honours in our final year. And there was one project that particularly caught my attention and interest, which concerned studying a tapeworm, a very tiny little tapeworm in mice. It had a 2-host life cycle. The other part of the life cycle is a tiny little beetle. And its common name is the dwarf tapeworm, or Hymenopus nana, to give it its grand name. And I did a project on this tapeworm living in mice and learnt more about its natural history. And I've never looked back.
So what's the tapeworm of the month for you, or the parasite of the month? Which one are you looking at right now?
Oh, that was a long time ago. I've moved on from that particular parasite now. Over the years, I've worked on a large number of parasites, not just tapeworms. Scientifically, they're referred to as cestodes, but also single-celled parasites, things like Giardia or Giardia that you may well have heard of or even have been infected with. But mainly,
that comes from like water sources, right? That can be infected with
it can be, and particularly in North America, that's where it's got a particularly bad reputation. But I suppose the common theme has been and is parasites that can be shared between humans and other animals. And the term for those parasites are called zoonoses, and that name means that can be transmission between the two.
Oh, so just like viruses can be zoonotic, I guess parasites can be too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's just that there's a separate discipline for viruses, virology, for bacteria, bacteriology. And then there's this huge group of organisms from single-cell things like malaria all the way through to multicellular organisms like tapeworms and ticks and so on that come under the umbrella of parasitology.
Okay, well, very good. Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking, I imagine you having a calendar on the wall with like parasite of the month, when I said it. I wonder if anyone would like that, as a gift. Each month there's a big picture of a new parasite and a brief description of it. I guess only parasitologists probably would. But
yeah, probably. I suppose nowadays with the great sort of imaging techniques that we have, you do get some amazing pictures of parasites, and some of them can look really awesome and quite cute sometimes, depending which ones you're looking at.
Yeah. So what's your current focus? Which parasite are you working on right now?
I suppose in recent years we've been concentrating on parasites of wildlife, particularly those that may have conservation effects, i.e. may affect the health of wildlife. And again, parasites that normally don't really cause much of a problem in wildlife, but as in many cases, human involvement, either by affecting the environment or creating conditions where parasites can spread, or introducing new parasites to which wildlife is susceptible, those things have been interesting us to a great degree.
Oh, what kind of parasites and which wildlife interests you?
Well, I'll give you a few examples. I don't know whether you've heard of Hydatid disease.
No, I haven't.
It occurs in North America and throughout the world. It's a cystic infection. Again, it's in the adult stage. It's a small tapeworm. And the larval stage is a cyst that manifests itself, large cysts up to the size of tennis balls or even bigger, in the internal organisms of the other host. And it's two-host life cycle, carnivores that harbour the small adult tapeworm, and then a whole variety of omnivorous or herbivorous animals that can harbour the cystic stage. And basically, in order for the cycle to continue, the carnivore has to eat the cystic stage. So you can imagine a natural cycle, as you have in North America, between wolves and moose, for example, moose with the cysts, and wolves, the predator, eating the cysts in the moose. And that's probably the best known natural cycle that occurs in the wild. But because of man's involvement in various parts of the world, the parasite has become, in inverted commas, domesticated. So it's very common in where you have livestock, such as sheep and dogs eating the cysts from the sheep, usually because of human involvement. Humans doing slaughtering the sheep. Farmers, for example, may be slaughtering a few sheep at home for their own use, and the dogs get into the offal from the slaughtered sheep, and the life cycle is completed. And that's the most common way throughout the world. Middle East, Europe, North America, this man-made domestic cycle. But it also can get into wildlife. I mentioned the natural cycle between wolves and moose or other large deer. But in Australia, for example, Hydatid disease never existed in Australia before settlers arrived. They brought their sheep and their dogs, and they started a cycle between sheep and dogs. And the dogs, infected with the tapeworm, contaminated the environment, which was shared by other grazing animals, kangaroos and wallabies. And they became infected with this hydatid parasite. So they were completely naive host. The parasite in the wallabies affects the lungs and grows to be sometimes quite big, affects the exercise performance of the wallabies and the kangaroos, so they become easier prey to animals like dingoes. So humans, unwittingly, in the early days of settlement, established this, what had become a domestic cycle, into a novel wildlife cycle in the Australian environment. And now Australia cannot eradicate Hydatid disease, because in order to eradicate it, we'd have to shoot all the dingoes and all the macropod marsupials. So that's a really good example of a parasite in wildlife that was introduced by humans. I have many more.
So what do you, where's your focus within the parasite world? Are you trying to figure out how to stop them, or simply to understand them and all the complexity of their behavior?
Well, initially, the end goal is to control it in some way. Initially, you have to understand it. So the initial studies with that, when we found these cysts in kangaroos, for example, and wallabies, we had to try and determine, was this here before settlement? Has it always been in Australia? So to compare the parasites, i.e. the ones in the macropod marsupials and the ones in sheep. Initially, you do that under the microscope. They look the same. But then, with the advent of molecular tools, you can compare the DNA. And we determined, along with other colleagues, that the parasites were identical. So that it was the same as the ones that had been introduced into Australia in sheep. So we knew we were dealing with a parasite that we could control in sheep and dogs by legislation, telling farmers that they shouldn't feed their sheepdogs on home-killed sheep. But you can't do that with a wildlife cycle. And so we basically in Australia now have a cycle that we understand. It does harm to the wildlife. If people hunt kangaroos and then feed the offal to their dogs, then they could start a cycle in their own domestic dogs. So it's a question of education, but it could never be eradicated.
Well, why not? What happens if you cook, the kangaroo meat or the organ meat? If you really want to feed it to your animals, what if you cook it? Will that solve the problem? Will that break open the cysts and make it edible?
That would solve the problem. And certainly with, say, the sheep-dog cycle, farmers are encouraged, one, not to do it, but two, if they do it, or dogs accidentally get into a carcass of dead sheep on pasture, then that meat that they harvest has to be cooked. But really, the bottom line message is don't do it.
Well, why say don't do it when cooking would solve it? It's like what would a farmer do with that waste then? Just throw it and then see, if you're going to store it, wild animals will smell it and love to get into it. So I think that would cause wild animals to approach your encampment. And if you're going to just get rid of it, why waste it? It seems like that's a bad idea. It's better to cook it.
Right. Okay. Well, this is getting into a controversial area now. In Australia, for example, and New Zealand, many other current countries that have that raise sheep, Middle East, for example, it's been shown over many years that the only way to control this Hydatid disease in domestic cycles like that is by education. One, do not feed your dogs on raw offal, because you can say cook it, but people don't cook it thoroughly and the parasite still gets through. So the education campaigns that have worked have been education, and then if they don't do it, you have legislation. And in Australia, the end point was that farmers who were found to have infected sheep were, if they didn't obey the rules, then their farms were quarantined and they weren't allowed to sell their sheep. And so it became a domestic issue. There were some cases in Australia in the early days of the Hydatid control campaigns where farmers were even jailed because they wouldn't comply.
What do people do with the offal if they don't cook it and they're supposed to get rid of it? Like, what does get rid of it mean? Where can it go where it wouldn't be a harm and it wouldn't become
basically, they're advised not to home kill, but it can be buried or it can be theoretically boiled. When I was doing my PhD, when I did my initial education in England, and I did a PhD on Hydatid disease in horses in the United Kingdom. And there they had a cycle, they still have, but it's not as frequent as it used to be, involving foxhounds and horses. It was an artificial man-made cycle involving recreational pursuit of fox hunting. And I went round to some of these fox hunts where they used to feed horse meat back to the dogs. And all these hunts had huge boilers where after slaughtering the horses, they were supposed to boil the meat so that any infections, not just Hydatid, but other diseases, could be spread to their foxhounds. And I used to go to these places. It was a pretty an interesting way to start one's PhD. These hunts, many of them in these days, had huge, great big boilers, and you'd see these bits of carcasses sticking out of the boilers, and there was no way on earth that those boilers were functioning correctly, heating the meat up. And so we found Hydatid disease, or the tapeworms, to be prevalent in the foxhounds that we looked at.
So which host would be the easiest one to try to intervene and get rid of these parasites, or stop the tapeworms? And what do they call it? The definitive host, I guess, is that would be the dog that eats the offal, and the intermediate host is where it comes from.
Yep, exactly. I mean, basically, the message in not just Hydatid disease, but most of these zoonotic type cycles is break the cycle. So, number one, do the right thing and don't let the infection get into your dogs. But it can be backed up also with giving drugs to the dogs. There's very, very safe and effective drugs that you can give to dogs to kill the tapeworms now. So there's a two-pronged approach.
Is there a temporary something you can add to the food so that if a dog does eat, offal and it's contaminated, that it won't make it sick?
No, not really. If you think that the dog may have been exposed, then you can prophylactically give the dog these worming tablets. They work very well.
But there's nothing you can add to the meal to make it literally edible, where a dog could eat contaminated offal and they wouldn't get sick. No one's figured that out.
Only if it's cooked. Only if it's thoroughly cooked.
Okay, well, it's too bad,
But What I've been talking about there is the domestic cycle, but we can't do anything to prevent dingoes becoming infected from wallabies that they may have predated. So we have this artificial cycle in dingoes and wallabies, which contaminates the pasture that sheep may share. So it feeds over to the domestic cycle. Fascinating.
So I don't know. I mean, in studying the life cycles of these tapeworms, what does come to mind as an intervention? What can be done?
A vaccine is another possibility, and colleagues of mine at the University of Melbourne have developed an extremely effective vaccine that can be used to vaccinate sheep, for example, so that they don't get Hydatid disease.
Okay. So I guess this tapeworm, where does it reside when it goes into, dogs and other creatures and people, and just in the gut, or where does it go?
In the dogs, it's a small tapeworm lives in the gut, doesn't cause the dogs any harm whatsoever. In the other hosts, the intermediate hosts, kangaroo, sheep, humans, the cysts develop in the livers and lungs, and occasionally other organs, even the brain. So it can be extremely serious in other animals. In humans, it's probably most pathogenic, and usually in humans, surgery is required.
Oh, really? To remove the tapeworm? What kind of surgery?
Well, surgery that would expose the liver or the lungs so that the surgeon can aspirate the contents of the cyst and then remove the cysts by basically cutting it out of the liver or lungs. I mean, it's a pretty severe disease in people.
Yeah. Huh.
And there's various forms of the parasite, and I haven't got time to go into all of them, but there's another one that's more common in Europe, in Central Europe, that many medics regard as incurable unless it's caught pretty early.
Wow.
So that's a good example of a parasite that we basically have caused to spill over to wildlife.
So what can be learned from the tapeworm's evasion of our immune system or of other creatures' immune systems? I'm sure it's being studied in myriad ways. I mean, what can be learned from it, and maybe repurposed and used for other medicine?
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, you can't generalize from and say, what we learn with respect to Hydatid disease can be applied to other parasites. It can't. What we've learned with Hydatid disease is that immunity is generated in the early stages of infection in the intermediate host, humans and sheep, but very quickly the parasite develops this cyst which walls it off from the host's immune system. So it basically sits there and does its own thing, sitting in its cyst. And the antibodies, and we know there are protective antibodies, can't get at the parasite because it's within a cyst. So the parasite has this extremely effective defense mechanism.
But the cyst would have to allow is it totally dormant in the cyst stage? Or is it
not usually?
it would have to allow the passage of minerals and food, etc.
Oh, yes. Yeah, but the cyst is an extremely complicated, multi-layered structure, and the parasite allows certain things into the cyst, presumably cyst materials, nutrients, and so on. But antibodies can't get in there. One thing that surgeons can do prior to removing a cyst, the cyst is a bit like cancer, that if you leave a little bit behind, the parasite will regrow again. This is in surgery.
Oh, really?
And what surgeons can do before removing the cyst is to inject into the cyst some of the person's serum, knowing that serum will contain antibodies that can kill the parasite before they try and remove the cyst. So there are antibodies being generated, but as with many parasites, from tapeworms through to malaria, the parasites have evolved and developed mechanisms to help them survive in their host.
So if you remove part of a cyst, it's been determined that the remaining part will regrow back into a complete cyst?
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
So in the early days in Tasmania, when I'm going back to when they had the sheep-dog cycle, and they were educating people about the dangers of the parasite, the most effective pictures that came out on the educational leaflets were of little kids that had become infected, and just showing the scars on their chest and abdomen and back, where the surgeons had to cut in to get rid of the cysts. And those sorts of shocking photos really help to get the message across.
Huh. It seems perhaps the abilities of the parasite can be harnessed, for other medicines. So I guess, I know it'd be interesting to study them, to see how they do what they do. It's pretty amazing. Yep,
and there are many, many parasitologists doing that throughout the world at the moment with various parasites.
So what is your role? What is your particular role that you are engaged in? How do you want to, make an impact?
Well, my role has been, I suppose, number one has been to enthuse people, and probably the greatest joy that I've had throughout my career as a professor has been a mentor and supervisor of research students. And so enthusing other people, young people, about parasites and the ways in which we can study them has been the most enjoyable part of my career, I think.
Are there any up-and-coming treatments for various parasites that you think really show a lot of promise, or are there any breakthroughs in understanding? For instance, like you said, how a partial cyst could regrow to become a full one?
No, not really. I've just, with some colleagues, edited a large volume on Hydatid disease, and there's a huge chapter in there on the clinical aspects, with myriad ways of operating and that have been developed, and of diagnosing using CAT scans and various other radiological techniques to try and diagnose infections early. As I said, the vaccine has been developed, but the big thing is getting enough money to allow the vaccine to be distributed and used in areas of the world where the parasite is most common, particularly in developing countries. And it's the old problem there of not having pharmaceutical companies interested in promoting the vaccine because they're not going to make enough money from using the vaccine in developing countries like Africa and the Middle East.
Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work and about your students and everything? Where can they go?
Well, there's a website, and I think you've already got that website. I saw that you'd referred to it in some of the emails I got earlier. But basically, going to my university, Murdoch University, and searching myself and my other colleagues in parasitology. And, of course, the main way in which we get our message out is by publishing. So I published a fair few papers and books people can read and are available.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, what's the name of some of the books that people can check out if they'd like?
Oh, right. Well, perhaps the most recent one...
It's for lay people or more advanced,
the biology of Echinococcus and Hydatid disease.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the most recent volumes that I mentioned. It's published by Academic Press and Advances in Parasitology.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Andrew, thank you for coming. And again, I really appreciate the fact that you got up at an odd time to do this. So thank you so much. And you've been a good guest. Thank you.
Fine. My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.